A recent study with almost 182,000 participants published in Nature Mental Health concluded that a balanced diet was better than both a vegetarian and several other diets in supporting brain and mental health. But what does a balanced diet even mean? And why did this diet have a leg up over the 3 other popular diets it was compared with? Hi, I'm Jess. I'm a clinical nutritionist, and on this channel we talk about how diet and nutrition impacts both your brain and mental health. Today we're looking at a study that compared 4 different dietary profiles and explored how these patterns impacted various aspects of brain health, which is basically like an umbrella in which they included mental health, cognitive function, metabolic biomarkers, and brain structure as measured using MRI. The dietary profile that proved to be the best for pretty much all of these markers was a balanced diet. Now, we're going to, of course, talk about what exactly balanced means in this study and as well as the study's limitations. It's important to acknowledge that most studies in nutrition science are likely going to have a lot of limitations because there's often just so many variables to account for. But even with limitations, many of the takeaways appear to be pretty valid to me, especially when we look at some of the biomarkers that I'm excited to share with you. But before we dive into the findings, let's go over what exactly the 4 different dietary profiles are that we're comparing. The first group is referred to as a starch-free or reduced starch diet. Basically, this group preferred fruits, vegetables, and protein, but showed a lower preference for starchy foods like bread and pasta. So we could call this like a lower carb diet, but because they were mainly using starches like breads and pasta to really refer to this, it would be more appropriate to say that this would just overall be a low glycemic dietary trend. The second group is the vegetarian group. So this group preferred fruits and vegetables, but showed a lower protein preference. The third group is a high protein but low fiber dietary group, and this group preferred snacks and protein foods and had a lower preference for fruits and vegetables. So this isn't exactly like a high protein, low fiber diet that would be considered therapeutic like carnivore or keto, but this is more in lines with like a standard American style diet. And number 4, the balanced diet, is the group that showed similar preferences in all food groups. Basically, this group didn't exclude any particular category of foods, and you can see some of these categories listed here. So to go over some of these results, I'm going to hop over to my computer so that we can actually look at this study together and it will make a little bit more sense. Okay, we're here. So let's take a look at the study together. This is the study Associations of Dietary Patterns with Brain Health from Behavioral, Neuroimaging, Biochemical, and Genetic Analysis. So I'll put a link to this study, but I downloaded the study. I think it's easier to look at, as you can see here. It's important to note that the researchers basically use data from the US Biobank and base this upon food preference data. So essentially, as we look down here below, researchers asked about food preferences for a lot of different food categories: vegetables, fruits, fish, meats, alcohol, starches, etc. So essentially what this means is that people were not on a specific therapeutic diet. This isn't a clinical trial where we put people on like a keto diet and then this diet and then that diet. This is basically using data that is already available and then basing this off of people's food preferences. So that's something that is important to consider when going through all of this. But you'll still see there's some pretty cool takeaways. So let's look at this a little bit more. Okay, so looking at mental health. This study used a few different models to measure mental health conditions and symptoms, so anxiety, depression, psychotic experiences, but also self-harm, and then just feelings of well-being. What were the results? So the higher scores indicated poor mental health, except for the well-being measurement, where a higher score suggested better mental health. So as you can see here, here are some of the scales that they used and some of the imaging here. And what was found overall was that subgroups 2 and 3 scored the highest, indicating poor mental health. If we go back up here, I believe they mentioned here, subtype 2 and 3 had relatively higher scores in some mental health measures, such as anxiety, depression symptoms, and relatively lower levels of well-being. And then they mentioned down here, subtype 4, and just remember, subtype 2 and 3, that's the vegetarian group, and then the like standard American diet, high protein, low fiber group. Subtype 4, which is the balanced diet, scored the most in most mental health measures and the highest in well-being, indicating better mental health conditions. So overall, the study found that a balanced diet subtype saw the most benefit out of all 4 groups. Those in the balanced dietary subtype had lower scores for most mental health measurements and higher scores for well-being. So that's pretty cool. But now let's look at the metabolic markers, because I think the metabolic markers actually support what was found in terms of the mental health outcomes of these various diets. Okay, so distinctive blood and metabolic markers across the subtypes. This is the chart here that was shown. It's honestly, it's really hard to read. It's not easy to read. This is some of the brain imaging that they did as well, but these are a lot of the markers that they were looking at on here. So basically, the findings indicated that the 4 subtypes had significantly different levels of several biomarkers, such as omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. So number 4, the balanced diet had better cardiovascular markers, while the low fiber standard American diet had the worst cardiovascular risk markers. And then in comparison with type 4 and 1, so the balanced diet and the low starch diet, the vegetarian diet and the low fiber standard American diet both exhibited significantly lower levels of omega-3 fatty acids, which is likely because of the lack of fish consumption in those subtypes. One thing that was mentioned on here in this study was that they didn't measure levels of tryptophan, which obviously would have been helpful if we're looking at markers associated with mental health and amino acid availability, but it's actually not like a super easy thing to measure, and this was basic blood work. So what is the significance of all these blood markers? Well, subtype 2 and 3, which are the vegetarian and the standard American diet, are the lowest in omegas. And omega-3 fats play a critical role in mood regulation and brain health. So basically, in a standard American diet, it's basically saying that it's lower in omegas. People aren't eating a lot of fish, maybe because they have the preference for snacky foods. And then the vegetarian diet sounds like more like a vegan diet, where it's not pescatarian, they're not eating a lot of fish overall. So we can see how these dietary preferences essentially mirror blood markers and things that really actually matter when it comes to mental health and mood outcomes. And then lastly, the study also looked at gray matter of the brain, as well as some genetic factors as well. So we're just going to briefly touch upon those. People in the balanced dietary group had the highest levels of gray matter in certain areas of the brain, especially when compared to the high protein, low fiber group, which actually had the lowest. And then there were also some genetic factors that were looked at as well. What was found was that the balanced dietary group had a relatively lower genetic risk for most mental disorders. And in contrast, the vegetarian group had a higher genetic risk for Alzheimer's, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and several other mental health disorders. So one of the things that came up in this study is when when they're talking about the vegetarian group and genetics is that they cannot say that a vegetarian diet is causation for a higher risk of these mental health concerns because several genetic variants that we see more in mental health conditions also came up more in this specific group, which I understand how that then does not equal a causation, but it's also another interesting takeaway that a lot of people in these vegetarian groups have these specific types of genes that also correlate to their food preference. We've already mentioned them a little bit, but let's talk about some limitations of this study because they actually have a whole section where they do go over that. So like was mentioned before, this isn't people being put on a specific diet, but the results have shown that food liking measures were very closely related to food consumption, but subtle differences may exist and could influence the basically observed relationships. This is a cohort that was recruited over 20 years ago. So basically there is some population limitations and most of the members in this study were between the ages of 53 and 87. So this is definitely a specific age range regarding the study. And lastly, this research focused on mainly healthy individuals who responded to these questionnaires. So that's always something to consider as well. So we've gone through limitations, but let's talk about like some of the overall takeaways from this study that I think are important. So one that they mentioned that I copied and pasted here was the identified dietary patterns reflect the usual eating habits in normal life, which can lead to meaningful investigations of their associations with brain structure and health. So even though this isn't a clinical trial where this diet was put up against this diet for a specific period of time, these are people's normal dietary patterns over a significant period of time. And I think sometimes that can give us even more information than just a very short window of time where we may see some therapeutic effects, but we don't really actually know like how long lasting that is or how those things are gonna stand up against each other overall and over time. My overall takeaway and reflection of this study mirrors what I see every day when I work with people is that we often think that more extreme diets or certain diets in general is going to lead to a better therapeutic outcome. But over time, if we completely cut out complete categories of foods like animal protein, for example, that may actually have some consequences on our brain and mental health, while including more processed and refined foods also over time, of course, has its negative consequences as well. If you enjoyed this video, then don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and you may be interested in this video here if you haven't seen it already. That is about a study that looks at the consumption of processed food over time and how a greater intake of processed food leads to a greater risk of depression long term. So hopefully I'll see you in that one.